Welcome to the 27th OpenChain webinar. Today we're talking about ISO 5230 Readiness Assessment. As always with our webinars, you can jump in with questions and comments at any time. Before we start, here's our antitrust policy notice. You can read the full notice on our website. With that, I'd like to hand over to Julian for our webinar presentation.
All right, thank you. And thank you for this chance of presenting the open source readiness assessment at this webinar. Today, we want to talk about the ISO 5230 readiness assessment. And first off, let's have a look at who I am. My name is Julian, and I'm from the PwC office in Germany. I'm an OSS manager for open source software management services at Düsseldorf. I'm a computer scientist, and I do OSS consulting and OSS enablement for years. And I'm focused on building the right tool chains and building models that work well with scaling in modern infrastructures. Before we dive into the readiness assessment, we have to focus on the certification itself, because the certification is what drives the whole idea. The certification of ISO 5230 is an attempt to complete the package. Many companies already have some sort of operational open source compliance management system. They are able to check the contents of their software and communicate about the compliance requirements. However, without a certification on top, it is often unclear how exactly this fits into a broader scheme of standards, and it is unclear what exactly the scope of a given compliance system is. For this, a certification, especially an ISO certification, allows a way to compare different systems by following a given set of rules. And this allows a lot of trust to go into an already existing compliance management program. For OpenChain, we have multiple ways to certify. We have the self-certification and the third-party certification. With the self-certification, of course, providing a lot of value and basically being a statement that OpenChain is to be followed within the company. The third-party certification, especially with the requirements of the ISO, allows a more in-depth verification of that. It allows a certified company to have a very strict and accurate scope that defines where exactly OpenChain is effective and where it just doesn't apply. Now, the question on why to actually do OpenChain conformance is a complicated one. For suppliers, there are multiple benefits. They can be to just prove to your to supplied companies that a given compliance management system works or is in effect. So it is a seal of quality. For companies who engage with suppliers, it might reduce the internal efforts, because most companies tend to reevaluate what they get. They tend to not have a clear communication routes on who to speak with, on what standards to talk with. And OpenChain allows this to be a lot more standardized, and maybe even not do some checks, because we have a certified compliance system at the suppliers, which might just fit the bill already. But to get there, we have to have some sort of roadmap. And just starting out of the blue with an ISO 5230 certification isn't the right approach for every company. And for this, we've coined the Readiness Assessment. It's an approach to basically get a certifier's professional feedback early. And this can have various reasons. Maybe there's a hard to fix issue, something that you just want to get out of the way, want to understand how this would be a problem for a certification. Maybe it's prior to a large rollout, just to understand whether or not the program as it stands now could be certified at all. And sometimes just to check for conformance of the given process. Maybe the certification isn't even on the horizon, but to have an idea whether or not the program as it stands could be certifiable, which provides a lot more perspective into outstanding issues, maybe like scaling to other departments or scaling to the whole entity. To do this, the readiness assessment, of course, looks very similar to the ISO audit, and it has to be, because it needs to make sure the ISO audit has a good chance of success. The ISO audit follows various rules set by the ISO. Most of them are described in ISO 17021, which basically define how an audit is to be conducted. It defines that pre-certification activities and a certain level of scoping have to be defined, that that we start the audit by checking the documentation and assess the design effectiveness of the whole system. And after this, certify the operational effectiveness of the system, which all yields into an initial certification decision, and this certification that can be maintained. The readiness assessment is very similar, of course. It starts by scope and depth. The scope, of course, is similar to the certification itself, because scope is one of the most important aspects in certifying a whole company, certifying a program. Because unless a program applies to the whole company, the whole group, it is very hard to pin down where it is applicable. And this is exactly the scoping that this kind of this phase has to do, and that is very important for the certification later on. Additionally, there's depth. The readiness assessment doesn't have to be accurate. And although we know where we want to look and what is a good thing to check, every engagement can be different. And how deep the readiness assessment is, this is up to the company in question. This, of course, is different to the ISO. The ISO audit, of course, have to have the deepest depth possible. But for the readiness assessment, we can make this as light as we like. And this, of course, reflects on what to check. There are spot checks of processes and guidelines, and not a whole review of all documentation, but looking out for the most important aspects and see whether or not they fit the bill. Additionally, the certification of OpenChain requires a given set of operational tests. So we check whether or not, for instance, a bill of material is generated and a defined process is followed. Now, in the readiness assessment, this is a very useful test as well, because we want to see that the system works in reality, but we don't have to do this for everyone. So as an example, we have to make a test of one to see that the process works, and the way we've seen it work would be compliant to the ISO certification. However, we don't need to check whether or not it applies to the whole brand or globally. This we would do in the ISO certification and maybe not do here. This, of course, then yields into findings and recommendations. And the whole difference between a readiness assessment and a normal consulting engagement for this kind of compliance program is that the readiness assessment allows the certifier to still be impartial. The certifier checks whether or not the existing system fits the bill and can draft the findings and recommendations. By not building the system, the certifier still is impartial and can still do a certification later on, which means the whole remediation activities have to be done by the audited company. This cannot be done by the one who made the readiness assessment. Now, how exactly does the readiness assessment come up with its results? Now, in the ISO audit and as well in the readiness assessment, there are multiple approaches. First, there are interviews, and there's a review of documentation and an observation of processes and activities, all of which are subject to sampling. So as you might imagine, we want to talk to a given set of personnel on whether or not they understand how the program works, what their key contacts are, and so on. We don't task everyone, but just a given set of people. And similar to the observation of process and activities, we want to see that some of them work. And of course, the readiness assessment has a lot less of this because we make sure that the process as it is defined works. We don't yet have to make sure it works everywhere. This is the problem of this main certification. And all of this, of course, results in findings, issues, and recommendations for improvements. And to give you an idea how this translates into reality, Section 331 of the ISO standard mentions the bill of materials. And just looking at the top row, we have the tool chain and processes that build the bill of material. And to check this, we have a wide variety of audit approaches actually that we want to use. So we do want to see, starting on the right, that the process has been done. And we want to make sure it is sane. We do want to see it defined and described in the documentation appropriately. And we do want to see that personnel is aware of it and knows how to work with it. This, of course, applies here. It doesn't always apply to all other sections of the standard. For instance, for license compliance, sometimes we don't want to sit and see whether or not this works. As an example, a allow and deny list should exist, whether or not the legal department checks this by heart or not. This, of course, is something we don't have to sit by. They have a clear rule on how to follow it. And now this is then executed. Now, we've had different cases in the past where a readiness assessment has become the weapon of choice, so to speak, on tackling the OpenChain conformance issue head on. First, there's the story of an internal IT supplier whose main focus is on improvement and fix possible issues. This is a large supplier who is about to scale its business and hence wants to make sure that the whole system as it is as certifiable as possible. So it is possible to get the ISO certification at an early stage after the rollout. Another one was the OEM supplier who as well is just starting with a large-scale rollout, but is unsure about the certification. But still, it is important for this supplier to be ISO compliant and see whether or not the system provides errors, to be open for this decision later on. As most of you may know, the OpenChain standard is still very young, and whether or not it is enforced, this is still up for debate in some industries, and this here is the case as well. Stay compliant as much as possible, and once requirements arise, we are ready for it. The last one was a small supplier who is requested to meet 50 to 30 requirements and is currently quite greenfield on OSS compliance. And the idea is to give a very early feedback for the certification, for the program, to maybe get certified later on, but to have a good idea on how the project is evolving, as there are little reasons to not be ISO compliant if you're starting on the green field. Now, there are some examples on what kind of findings can result from such an audit. What we've seen in readiness assessments is, of course, very good. Most companies have spent a lot of time with compliance systems for open source. And of course, these systems are, for many companies at least, are very effective already. But there are sometimes parts that are, from a certification standpoint, hard to certify or cannot be certified in the way they stand right now. An example for this is the common idea that bill of materials have to be generated for the customer specification. Now, OpenChain wants a bill of material, so you understand what's in your program, in your products. But as many companies follow the idea that they just have to generate something that someone requires, the exact format is sometimes not defined. And this is a problem. Now, if the policy states that a BOM is generated according to customer specifications, this will result in some issues. First, the customer specifications, unless explicitly done, are not part of the certification scope. Hence, we cannot assume their quality. What does that mean? Such a policy usually results in the customer specifications not being part of the whole program. They are expected to be found at the operational units. The problem is, if this is the only bill of material ever created, it is completely unclear what format it is unless we ask the staff in question. And as it is usually not documented, especially not for the program itself, it is not part of the program scope and hence cannot be certified that way. And of course, this yields to operational issues just for the effectiveness. The formats are most likely incompatible and sometimes even incomplete. Just because a customer demands a certain format for bill of material, it doesn't necessarily mean it contains all information. For instance, quite often, license information are missing because this customer specification focuses on security. Now, this might be a problem, especially considering the next part, which is the archival. The OpenChain standard does want the bill of material to be archived and accessible just for review. Now, if we don't know what's inside, and if we don't know whether or not the format is machine readable, maybe, this will result in operational issues. And again, the necessity of undocumented knowledge is given. But there are usually quite simple solutions to this. Most companies that have have a policy in this way know from a more have a more broader data set available that they just strip down to customer specifications. And in this case, sometimes it is just a good idea to generate a sufficient BOM, a standardized sufficient BOM, and archive it. This is a simple fix early on, which doesn't change anything for the customer relation, but provides a system that is certifiable and just fits the bill. And I hope this gave you a good insight on how a readiness assessment works. And if there are any questions, please go ahead.
I am sure we're going to have a ton of questions. I would love to open with one. If I understand correctly, the way you approach this in PwC is similar to the way you approach other standards, and you do this in two parts, the readiness assessment, and then you have another process later, which is essentially an assessment of a thing running. And today we're talking about the readiness assessment. And you mentioned that a lot of companies are somewhat nervous about whether they're ready for this and so on and so forth. It sounds like a lot of companies may not be fully cognizant or using standardized software bill of materials as one issue. Would you say that's a generally true statement?
I think so. Most people, most companies consider compliance to be something required of them, less of something they want to do themselves, which they feel good with. And this tends to be, this leads to the idea that whatever we are doing is not what is required. Hence, yes. But basically, the first thing you said, doing this in 2 phases, well, we at PwC don't really mind just starting out with the ISO certification, right? The readiness assessment is nothing we strictly require. This is something that has been requested over and over because most companies just don't feel great about their compliance. It usually is. It's better than expected. But before getting into the certification, people want to have some feeling of how this works, right? Look at at other ISO standards. You have a very good understanding what's required because people have walked through it, and you've probably have at least 1 or 2 people in the company who have been through it. This is not the case for 50 to 30, and this creates a lot of uncertainty, I believe, to whether or not one would pass or wouldn't. The other part is the question whether or not if this works. This is actually ISO defined, right? So checking the design effectiveness of a thing and the operating effectiveness is actually defined. So this is a part of the certification that has to be done anyway.
Makes sense. Now we have quite a few people on the call, so I want to pause here and see if others have questions at this juncture. Mary, I see your hand is up. Over to you.
Okay. My question, first of all, so that I can set the kind of the groundwork, are you familiar with the automotive space and A-Spice?
Yes.
Okay. So my company is an automotive company, an automotive supplier. We do A-Spice assessments. Those are internal assessments that we use an internal assessor network, and our OEMs are comfortable with that. What do you think of using that A-Spice assessor network for our 5230 compliance checks and self-certification?
That's a hard question. This is a very strategic question that you have. Yes, we've had this before. I think the short answer is if it works, yes. Okay. If you get that kind of knowledge into of required processes into these assessors, from the top of my head, I wouldn't see a reason why this wouldn't work. But this obviously only applies to the A-Spice, and yet maybe you have an idea of how well this works, because what I've heard so far is that this is not a simple process to add, especially to the spice assessors.
Okay, what have you heard that makes it difficult for the A-Spice assessors to also then do OpenChain? So just
different and new process.
Okay.
It's just a different new process. If you make it work, if you have a network, I believe whether or not this will work out, I think this is very hard because, of course, the supplied companies will have to decide on that. But on the other hand, if the assessors do great work and they want to do this kind of work and they do this consistently, not just 1 or 2, so all of them, it's very hard to actually guess how this will play out.
Okay, cool. Thanks for the feedback. I have another question. So we are a very large company, And certifying the entire company is a horrendous amount of effort. Even on ASPICE, we don't do that for the entire company. It's on a project basis. So what about doing 5230 certification on a project basis?
Perfectly doable.
Okay.
This is basically related to other ISO standards who try to, so basically ISO allows scoping, right? You don't have to be ISO compliant with everyone at all the time. You are very well capable to say this applies for, let's say, the site. We have the concept of virtual sites where you don't have to put it down physically. There's a wide way of possibilities to create a certifiable thing that is not the whole company.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
No problem. Sammy, I see your hand.
Sorry, if I can find the mute button, I will see faster. It's actually slightly taking on Mary's question. And one of the challenges that we faced is that when we're looking at a whole company sort of certification, is what do you do with the thousands of products that are still out there that you're still shipping and distributing? And I wondered what approaches you have been recommending to customers. I will share with you once you've answered what we have chosen to do, but I'm just curious, whether other companies have faced a similar challenge.
Absolutely. I believe the shorter answer is scope, scope, scope. Most certifications tend to have a very large scope. They're not large in terms of area, but in terms of its definition. It's very precise that you exactly define where it applies and where it doesn't. And if there's no way to get OpenChain conformance onto existing products for some historical reasons, they can't. Hence, you need to find a way to put them out of scope. Or find a different solution to it. Maybe you have one.
Yeah, I mean, we have taken a slightly different approach in that we said we're not going to look retrospectively at anything that has been shipped. But if a new version or an updated version of that same product has gone or is going to be released, that has to follow the standard process that creates the conformance. So there was quite a bit of engineering effort. Particularly, when you have some products that are 10 years old, but you occasionally do a maintenance release on those, that's quite a big engineering effort, and we had to put the infrastructure in place to support that. That's the approach that we have taken.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can make that.
Yeah, I must say it did work, but I had to push very hard to get that done.
Absolutely. Well, great. I believe this is, of course, the better answer, right? If you can just make more things compliant, this is a great thing. But from an auditor's perspective, all I can do is just find a way not to look at it. And this can be done by scoping it out. It's just not part of the new scope. Yeah. This is a way, but of course, if you're willing to do this kind of effort, this, of course, is greater.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah.
Now, we had some news. Jan, unfortunately, cannot make it today, so we have more time for questions on this topic. And what I'd like to do is actually do a sideways question here and just make a note that there are now 4 global certifiers in the OpenChain project. So there's PwC, there's Synopsys, there's TÜV and there's Orcro. And for instance, TÜV's Japanese office is in charge of managing what they're doing. And we have, obviously, Orcro in the UK and Synopsys based out of the US. So we're seeing a lot of very different entities working in this space. And I just wanted to ask you, my observation would be there seems to be, in terms of your customer bases, no real geographic limit. So the fact that it's the German office doesn't necessarily reflect that all of your clients or so on would be German. And I just wanted to get the feel from you of how global is the engagement from the typical PwC partners. Is it isolated primarily to the German automotive space at the moment, or what's happening there?
Well, I'm not going to lie, of course, this is, there's a German market, of course, is something that I just am in, right? There's a good chance that it's stronger than anything else, but it's global demand. It's as simple as that. Companies work globally. As a global certifier, we of course get requested from other countries. This is so yeah. We see this on various places actually.
One thing that has been very interesting recently regarding certification is we've had interest in Taiwan from a local certifier. And we're seeing some very large movements in China regarding OpenChain adoption, which you'll hear more about in a month or two. So it looks like down the supply chain, awareness is being built. Though your readiness assessment note, I think, is pretty vital. A lot of these companies are hearing about it, and they're working out how to prepare. And they can do that through the community, but a lot of people are looking for service providers to lend a hand as well. Jeff just raised his hand, speaking of which, and over to you, Jeff.
Thanks so much, Shane and Julian. Really interesting presentation. A question I have is, one of the problems that causes our lack of knowledge of bill of materials, people don't know what tools they're using, they don't know what, where things are coming from, often is reflected in the organization itself. We don't know, we know the big divisions, but we don't always know the product teams and the sub-product teams and so on and so on. What have you found useful, kind of whether it's coming, I guess, top down in your certification efforts, to help companies understand everything they're building, every layer, every product? And is that coming up in your certification right now? Do you have to talk to each one of those sub-organizations? Or is that something that you're putting trust that the organizations themselves are going to identify and talk to those people?
Well, I think there's multiple questions. Of course, for the so yes, within the certification, we have to make sure that things actually work. Hence, I have to ask the developer whether or not he knows how to get this bill of material. Well, it doesn't have to be the developer; it has to be anyone who is in scope as a person and who has some role. So whoever is responsible for the bill of material needs to understand it, or at least understand how to get it. Right? This is a simple thing. And further down the supply chain, of course, this is a different question. If you want to have a certifiable system, there needs to be and stuff is getting in your organization that is uncertified. Well, trust isn't really the word I would use here. So this needs to be addressed in some appropriate way. But maybe there are different things. So, but getting the knowledge into developers for SPDX, for instance, this is just training, right? This is even part of the OpenChain spec, and this is what I've learned. Once there is some training on the broader for the staff available, that just makes it quite clear what is required and why it's required. And for instance, the Linux Foundation has some great tutorials on that. People tend to understand a lot easier than if they're required to fulfill this high standard that is SPDX, right? Because SPDX is complex unless you know what you're actually looking for.
It looks like we've covered quite a few questions there. Does anyone else have anything they would like to bring to Julian while we've got him on the line? Sebastian, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to ask Julian a bit about the international scope that you brought up, Shane. And I was wondering if there were particular difficulties in the bill of materials for language barriers. Do suppliers and consumers have problems translating some of the contents of those bill of materials? Is that a difficulty?
At least to my knowledge, not a large scale. No, this is it depends on where you're working at, but usually the content should be to a certain degree in English. And actually, I haven't had too many bill of materials that tend to be just one language only.
Thank you. So it's a primarily English landscape with software bill of materials.
At least for the supply chains, put it that way. I mean, this is a quite broad question. So, of course, I've seen multiple bill of materials in multiple languages, especially those that are not standardized, not a question. But those that have to work with it tend to get it in the language they require, right? So let's say you have a bill of material that is not SPDX compliant and maybe something Excel based, maybe in Indian. The chances are pretty good that whoever is going to receive it is either knows this language, or it is not in Indian, it is in English, right? So this is just something I've encountered. While there is theoretical variety, it doesn't tend to block too many things, but sometimes, of course, most likely it does.
Thank you.
An observation here, at the moment we have essentially English as a global trade language, though rapidly we're seeing the emergence of Mandarin in the form of simplified Chinese appearing more and more. And I've noticed that, for example, the two variants, the permissive and copyleft versions of the Mulan license, are, I think, a pretty clear indication that we will be addressing the market in slightly different ways, a transition period in the next decade or two. I assume that we might manage this in much the same way as OpenChain has approached it, which is having tons of reference translations and material in lots of languages. And we hold our events all around the world in local languages to do that. I'm going to have to ask some of the SPDX people here. My impression, and this goes to Alexios and it goes to Sammy and so on, who've got deep knowledge. My impression of SPDX is that the tags are pretty short, pretty narrow, and therefore switching between languages should be far less painful in terms of guidance documents and usage of SPDX than it might otherwise be. Would that be an accurate statement?
Well, SPDX defines the format for the exchange, right? So the tags used are in English, but this is the same as saying, HTML is in English because it has header and P for paragraph and B for bold, right? We do not expect it to have localized version of the tags, right? But these are just, an indication of what is inside the format, right? For any content, so for example, text, that is, it can appear in any language, obviously. Right? So if you just want to, include the license text, this license text can be in any language.
Excellent.
Does this make sense?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm inclined to agree with Alexis on that. I mean, I think the danger in allowing languages of the short identifiers themselves is that you end up causing more confusion. I think you can have the explanations of what those individual identifiers mean in other languages, in the documentation, for example, those are all things that can be done. But having that consistency in saying, that the license field is, these are the expected ones, and the content can be in a different language. The example that Alexis gave is the license. Yeah, you can include the license in any other language. That's absolutely acceptable to make it easier for people to understand. And as I said, the important thing is the explanation what the fields mean. Is very critical to have those in local languages to make sure that there is a consistency in understanding of the specification itself.
Now, sorry, go ahead.
That's all very positive. Then I was intrigued to see if there were problems in the internal format itself with localization, and it seems as if those here have found that the internal format is adequate in one language, and that's very positive.
Now, as a side note here, and this is not directly relevant to Julian's presentation per se, but it speaks to what readiness assessment will be in the future. I suppose our engagement globally, for example, with the Japanese government through METI, our engagement with CESI in China and Open Atom Foundation, the key thing we'll be trying to do is to bridge everyone together so we don't get duplication of standards, and so that we're able to use each other's standards as effectively as possible, so we're all on the same path. And this practically goes without saying, Julian, but I assume PwC has a presence in China and will be part of that discussion over time.
Of course.
Yes, he says. Well, I'll actually be coming back to you on that, and maybe we can get someone on the China office to do this presentation to our China work group in August. We're going to have a meeting. As I said, we'll have some very significant announcements regarding China, so it could be good timing to give people a taste of what's out there in the vendor ecosystem. Right. We are just about done, but you have an opportunity to ask another question to Julian if you so wish. I'll pause here and see. All right. If there's no questions, Julian, thanks for giving us an insight into how you assist people. Obviously, the experience and scope of your organization is illuminating for us in how you deal with ISO 5230. And no doubt, we'll be collaborating closely with you and with the future with the SPDX project, as it's granted an ISO standard, to see how we can tie everything together in the market and hopefully make everyone feel very confident regarding their readiness. Okay, everyone, thank you for your time. Deeply appreciate you here, and have a lovely, safe day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.